So, Module 3 addresses how you might approach the appraisal of a research paper. The objectives of this module are split up in this overview in three separate sections because they deal more with the objectives of Chapter 5, 6, and 7. So, when you read through Chapter 5, you are presented with ideas that allow you to be able to describe why research is critiqued. You should be able to describe the structure of a research paper, explain the steps for critically appraising a research paper, and describe how to write a research critique. Appraisal is very important. If you look at the evidence-informed decision-making process, without appraisal and filtering out what you need or what you don't need, you will not be able to synthesize or create information that is relevant to your practice. There are several tips presented for you to be able to conduct a research appraisal. Box 5.1 is the general overview of the process, and they go through steps that you would undertake in order to be able to appraise a paper. Moving forward, what the chapter does is it goes into details about analyzing each section. For example, so you start by appraising the source. Where and when was the article published? Who wrote the article? So credibility of the author, credibility of the author's background, credibility in the sense of literature review and finding out information, gaps in information. The presentation of the material, is it logical? Is there an objective viewpoint? So have the authors considered conflicting points of view? And have the authors obviously missed something in their study? Is there a bias? Is there a blind spot? And this is an overall appraisal of the source itself, from where it comes, the journal, the individual, the institution, their ties to the field itself. Appraising the literature review is important because what you have to do when you appraise the literature review is you have to examine if the findings are from a variety of researchers. And that's key, because if we aren't experts at the field itself, the only thing we can look for is if the authors have consulted several different sources and if their sources are from peer-reviewed journals. Then our textbook talks about appraising the research question itself, and there are several steps to that. Once you finish appraising the literature, then you start appraising the data, the methods, and the results. And there are a bunch of steps that you'd go through to appraise each of these sections. You'd look at the analytical approach or theoretical framework, the methodology. Does it support other studies of the same topic? Is a similar methodology used? What makes this method feasible, and how realistic is it? Will it produce data that will answer the research question? And how does the method address questions of validity? Finally, a question that we ask is whether there were ethical guidelines followed. Now, you have to keep in mind that the Tri-Council policy is specific to Canada, so studies from the United States or different parts of the world, they may not have ethical approval from the Tri-Council because they're not required to. However, there should be some kind of ethical oversight that the authors refer to, which may be connected with the study. Appraising the conclusions is important. As you get to the end of the paper, you see conclusions, and the idea is the conclusions will address the limitations of the study, because no study can be all-encompassing. From your context, from where you stand, how do these limitations affect your ability to use the findings? It's important to understand if there's a correlation or cause, or there are alternative interpretations of the findings, and whether they are generalizable. Table 5.2 presents a critical appraisal of results from a research study. Make sure you look at that. And then we get into specifics about understanding and interpreting qualitative and then quantitative papers. Chapter 6 is all about qualitative papers. The objectives of Chapter 6 are to describe the key characteristics of qualitative research, describe methodologies, meaning of the results, judge the results, determine trustworthiness, and explain how research results help you provide care or service for your clients. If you're wondering why we use qualitative research, part of the reason is a lot of practice is embedded in narratives and qualitative research. And while the number of studies formalizing findings from qualitative research are significantly lower than summarized findings from quantitative studies, it is becoming more and more evident that qualitative studies and practice embedded in qualitative studies are becoming more and more central in the care of our fellow human beings. Just like any other chapter that you've encountered before, Chapter 7 will deal with a whole bunch of different key terms that you will learn the meaning of: auditability, credibility, ethnography, fittingness, grounded theory, phenomenology, rigor, and trustworthiness. Qualitative research does not deal with numbers. It recognizes that there are social and cultural influences and how people experience their world. It's essentially an understanding of the other's reality. It also helps us understand our own understanding of the world. As I mentioned, qualitative research has little to no numbers. It deals with people's varying realities, their perspectives, and recognizes that the researcher is part of the study. It also recognizes that context is important in interpreting results, and it collects a lot of narrative data that explains participants' perspectives. Also, the thing about qualitative research is analysis of the data is constant, it's ongoing. Table 6.1 of your textbook shows you different qualitative approaches, and it describes in a little bit of detail as to what you might expect in each type of study. So what do you do when you read a qualitative paper? Well, Table 6.2 lays out what you must do as you assess a qualitative paper. This template is important because you're going to use the same template to do your first assignment. So if you go through the table, it goes step by step as to how you would assess the research paper itself. Table 6.3 provides you information regarding an acronym called the FACTS, and this allows you to check credibility of the study itself. Table 6.4 of your textbook presents examples of how you might use qualitative studies in each of the three types of qualitative studies that have been presented earlier. Quantitative papers are different. They deal with numbers, they deal with large samples, and usually the samples that are chosen in quantitative studies are randomized in order to be considered representative. It's different from qualitative studies because sampling is not of primary concern. In fact, it's the individual experiences that are more important in qualitative studies. Quantitative studies, basically, there are several characteristics that you will be able to describe as one of the objectives. You will be able to describe methods, hopefully, in quantitative research and explain the meaning of the results of the quantitative studies. Now, keep in mind, so you'll be able to talk about p-values and what's a confidence interval. And also what you will be able to do by the end of Chapter 7 is explain how these results will help you provide care or service for your clients in health and practice. So the one thing I wanted to mention to all of you is the expectation that you will master the ideas of ethnography, grounded theory in qualitative research, or the idea that you will know fully well how p-values are derived, how confidence intervals work. may or may not be a realistic expectation depending on what your background in research is itself. Okay. However, it's more intended to be an exposure for you to be able to successfully read papers and interpret them. My suggestion would be to have your textbook handy when you're reading or assessing these papers as a relatively novice researcher. That way, if you have any questions about the meaning of certain tests, you can look at your textbook. Alternatively, feel free to Google or internet search terms that you don't understand, particularly those that deal with statistical tests. And there are several websites that are useful in explaining in very simple language what they mean. So, quantitative research generally analyzes questions about cause and effect. They are always quantifiable. They have a numerical element to them. The sample size is generally large because they are supposed to represent the population. Data analysis tends to be statistical, and it compares groups or describes trends or relates variables. It typically will compare its results with results obtained in the past as well. Table 7.1 goes into details of how you might analyze a quantitative study, and Table 7.1 addresses different quantitative methodologies. So there are several types of quantitative research papers. You can have an experiment or a quasi-experiment. You can have a randomized controlled trial. You can have a cohort study, a case control study, an ecological study, a cross-sectional study, and you can have a combination of experimental and quasi-experimental research. Now keep in mind there are more types of quantitative studies, and these are mentioned in your study guide. I won't go over them right now, but it's a good idea to understand that there are several different quantitative methodologies that can be used. Okay, now we get to table 7.2, which actually breaks down the analysis of a quantitative paper, or the steps to break down the analysis of a quantitative paper. So just like the qualitative paper, you're going to look at citation, the purpose and study rationale, the fit and specific rationale, the design, the participants, and look at the researchers, look at ethics, context, data, and so on. So